What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my ban list prediction for the April 2018 format. Now, we're in a bit of a weird predicament here because typically when we're around ban list season, there's usually an outcry for a ban list because everyone's sick of the format, there's one or two decks just running completely rampant, and everyone's generally unhappy with the game as a whole. However, what's interesting about the situation we're currently in is that it's actually the complete opposite. Everyone loves this format. I think this is one of the most popular formats we've had in quite some time, and while there are one or two decks that are the dominant decks, a lot of people are really happy with this format in general, and I don't think people want to see a massive overhaul of the ban list. I think with just a couple of modifications, we can actually take this format and make it even better. So I wanted to discuss what some of those options might be moving forward into the new format. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs today to Dwayne. You are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So obviously we're going to start with the big elephant in the room, and that deck is Pendulum Magician. Now, as diverse as this format is, and the fact that we see plenty of different decks making the top cuts of several different YCSs, Pendulum Magician is the outlier because it's still taking up anywhere from like 30% to sometimes 50% of the top cut representation. So obviously it's the strongest deck that has the highest representation. Now, obviously the deck has its strengths and weaknesses, but I think some people, as happy as they are with the current format, would like to see a check on the deck just to kind of cap its power down a little bit and bring it in line with the rest of the decks. So what can we hit to make Pendulum Magician a little bit more balanced? Well, the big thing would be hitting Electromite, because Electromite is kind of the main combo enabler that just allows Pendulum Magician to go off and do all the crazy things that it's capable of doing. But is Electromite really the root cause of the issue here? Because while Electromite is an extremely powerful card, Electromite also enables a lot of other pendulum-based strategies to have a lot of viability as well. I mean, stuff like Zephyra and other decks like that really rely on a card like Electromite to do some of these things that they're capable of doing and help keep them in the competitive spotlight as well. But then when you get to the root issue here, ASTROGRAPH is the card that Heavy Metal Foes Electromite is truly abusing. Every single time someone's going for their Electromite play, they're typically going to be sending ASTROGRAPH Sorcerer to the extra deck, and since you're capable of looping ASTROGRAPH Sorcerer pretty much indefinitely as long as you just have more plays, that's where Heavy Metal Foes Electromite gets a little bit abusive. But again, I don't think Heavy Metal Foes Electromite is to blame for that. It's kind of the card that starts it all, but if you take ASTROGRAPH Sorcerer out of the equation, what's really left? Because obviously you can still send cards to the extra deck through Electromite's effect, but you're not having this looping capability that ASTROGRAPH Sorcerer provides and really enables all this free advantage for all these different pendulum decks. So rather than hitting Electromite, having a check on ASTROGRAPH Sorcerer might actually be the way to go. And I think a lot of players might agree that this is the card that should either get limited or really just banned outright. If you limit ASTROGRAPH Sorcerer, realistically that doesn't do a whole lot because you can still loop one ASTROGRAPH Sorcerer with Electromite. It's a little bit of a curb on the deck's capabilities because having multiple ASTROGRAPH Sorcerers obviously is more ideal, but you're still able to loop the one, which means you're going to be able to get all this free advantage, and that's not exactly ideal for a, I guess, balanced competitive environment. So by banning ASTROGRAPH Sorcerer, taking it out of the equation entirely, it kind of shifts the dynamic of the deck, and the deck has to find a new way to function. Now, will the deck still be strong? I really think it will be. I don't think the deck is necessarily dependent on ASTROGRAPH's capabilities, but it definitely would be a significant enough hit that it would bring the power level of a deck like Pendulum Magician down with the rest of the decks in the competitive environment. Another card you could possibly hit is Supreme King Dragon Dark Worm. Now, this is a hit that the OCG just did on their April 1st ban list, and I think this is an interesting hit because while it does hit a lot of other decks as well, Dark Worm is a card that pretty much replaced Skullcrobat Joker for Pendulum Magician as the deck's main normal summon. On summon, it is a +1, and it really kind of fuels the deck and gets the deck going. So by hitting Dark Worm to 1, players now have to consider the fact that if you're playing 3 Dragon Shrine and a Foolish Burial for 1 copy of Dark Worm, if you hard draw that Dark Worm or you open multiple copies of that card, you know, Dark Worm becomes a little bit less consistent in the deck as a whole, and then you have to consider, well, is it worth running all these extra cards? So the deck doesn't become so dependent on opening the Dark Worm nearly as much, because that is the deck's power play. You're able to get Dark Worm onto the field for essentially free, and that's what kickstarts the deck into going into all of its absurd plays. So by hitting Dark Worm to 1, not only is it just pretty much putting that deck in check, but it also doesn't take away from some of these other decks, because some other decks only play a single copy of Dark Worm. I mean, decks that are utilizing cards like Dragon Shrine and things like that, they'll play Dark Worm and Destrudo, but it's just at 1 copy, so they don't really get affected. It's really only Pendulum-based decks that might rely on utilizing Dark Worm in multiple copies, and I think that might be a nice way to help bring the power level down of that deck as well. Now, on the notion of Pendulum Magician, I do think Independent Nightingale should just get axed and completely banned. As you guys know, I am not in favor of FTKs being prevalent, and even though the FTK hasn't been, I would say, as notorious as I was expecting it to be when it was first discovered, it's still a problem. I mean, just because something isn't as viable as a lot of people might consider it to be, that doesn't mean it's an issue that doesn't need to be addressed. And Konami TCG especially has been very adamant in their feelings about FTKs, and they typically just eradicate any FTK that seems to pop up on the radar, so I really think it would just be a nice opportunity for them to just get rid of it. Hitting Lyrilusk Independent Nightingale is correct, because Starving Venom is still a good card that Pendulum Magicians can utilize, or really any Dark Pendulum-based deck in general, and by hitting Lyrilusk Independent Nightingale, you're hitting a card that no one really cares about, and it's just a card that basically just enables degenerate FTKs as a whole, so I think that's the correct hit in that circumstance. Now, deviating from there, I think where I want to take the conversation next is True Draco. Now, I don't have really a definitive answer for how Draco should be hit, or if it should even be hit at all, because it is the second best deck, but at the same time, it has an interesting dynamic in the metagame. If you hit a card like Dragonic Diagram, you take away from other decks that utilize Diagram and make them viable at a competitive level, like Metaphors Draco, and you also have got stuff like True King Draco, Dino Draco, all these other decks that really take advantage of a card like Dragonic Diagram because of its generic ability just to pop cards. You take away from those decks' capabilities. You're hindering the consistency of True Draco, but you're also basically saying that these other decks aren't going to be able to exist because there's no card that can accurately replace a card like Dragonic Diagram. Then you look at Masterpiece. Now, Masterpiece is one of those cards that people are very polarized about when it comes to just looking at Masterpiece as a whole, and really it comes down to, is it oppressive enough that it warrants getting banned or limited? If you ban Masterpiece, True Draco as a deck really doesn't exist, because that's kind of the deck's win condition. Then you're just playing a deck that can draw a ton of cards and really doesn't do anything other than like summon Ignist or Majesty Maiden. In the OCG, they still have Dynamite Knight and things like that, so that actually makes the deck more of like a grindy type deck, but it doesn't really work the same way here in the TCG because we have Dynamite Knight banned. So by hitting Masterpiece to 0, well, that kind of just destroys Draco as a whole, but it lets other decks that utilize Diagram still exist in the meta. Then you've got stuff like hitting Masterpiece to 1. Now, 1 Masterpiece is kind of interesting because it allows Draco to survive, but are players gonna play Draco knowing they only have 1 Masterpiece, and when that Masterpiece dies, they're kind of just basically screwed? I don't know, but a lot of the times 1 Masterpiece is usually all these decks need to pretty much achieve their win condition and flat out win a game entirely. So that's an interesting decision. And then you also have to look at cards that are outside of the Draco archetype in general. Card of Demise, for instance. Card of Demise is a way that the deck can continuously refill its resources, and it's one of the reasons the deck is able to compete so well. But by hitting Card of Demise, you're hitting other decks that take advantage of Card of Demise as well, and I think one of the biggest things here is when you look at it in tandem with other cards like AMANO-IWATO. Now, AMANO-IWATO is a card that's had a lot of discussion circulating around it recently because AMANO-IWATO doesn't allow you to interact with your opponent while they're doing all these crazy things like drawing cards, using just everything at their deck's disposal completely unhindered, and if you go first and you're going up against a Draco deck, you've set up your board, they drop AMANO-IWATO, it doesn't matter what you did, you basically can't can't play Yu-Gi-Oh! For that entire turn, and a lot of people really don't like that. Now, there's also a card like Inspector Border, but if you drop Inspector Border onto your opponent's board going second, most likely they have cards that are summoned out of the extra deck, so it doesn't have that same blanket effect that AMANO-IWATO does. And the thing is, Draco, when in the presence of all these hand traps, can actually has an inherent balance to it. I mean, you can Ash stuff like Card of Demise, you can Ogre cards like Diagram, or, you know, the Heritage, things like that. But then when you have AMANO-IWATO in the mix, the fact that they can do all this unhindered is a little bit unfair. So some people argued for AMANO-IWATO to go on the list. Realistically, I don't know what the correct answer is here. I don't know if Draco should be hit at all, because if you curb the power on Pendulum Magician, the meta will have to shape in an entirely different way, and maybe Masterpiece won't be as big of a deal depending on what decks rise up from other decks getting hit. So this is something I want to leave up to you guys to kind of decide if Draco even needs to be hit, and if so, what you guys think the best approach for that would be. Rounding up this video, I wanted to discuss a couple of one-off cards that don't really fall in any particular category. Since we talked about FTKs, some would argue that Gem Knight Lady Lapis Lazuli, the fusion monster, should be hit to 1 or just banned altogether, just to stop the Gem Knight FTK. I'm kind of in favor of this because, as you guys know, like I said, I don't really favor FTKs at all, but at the same time, this is a deck that pretty much centralizes everything around the FTK. It's not a deck that can play, but also has an FTK. So you're having to play all these really bad cards for the deck to function, because you're playing just all these garnets, so to speak, and that literally actually makes sense in a deck like Gem Knights, ironically enough. But you have to realize that the deck hasn't been doing as well. It's maybe almost made the top cut of a YCS. I think it might have made one top cut while also bubbling in a couple others. But again, it goes back to that argument, is it fair even though it's not doing well? So I think I would be okay with this hit in general. And then there's also a card like Scapegoat. Now, Scapegoat also has a lot of discussion around it, because this is a card that is now being completely abused for all the wrong reasons, thanks in part to Link summoning, and I think Scapegoat's time has come. Scapegoat is weird because it's one of those cards that if it resolves on your opponent's end phase when it's your turn and you get all 4 goats, you're probably going to win that game, because that means you're either going to go into a board like Saryuja, or you're going to be able to do stuff like Ib and Ningirsu and just draw and be able to remove your opponent's threats. Scapegoat is a very swingy card, but it's also good because it's like an offensive and defensive card, but you have to wait an entire turn for it to be extremely effective. I think a lot of people are really fed up with Scapegoat in the perspective that you really, when your opponent just flips the Scapegoat, you might as well just scoop it up, because more often than not, if they do, that should spell game over, because they're going to be so ahead in terms of advantage at that point. The fact that it's Saryuja for free, they get to refresh their entire hand with not only their starter cards, any extenders, but also hand traps as well. That usually should just spell demise for anyone going up against the Scapegoat, and it kind of just buffs decks that don't necessarily really can function without it, and I don't know if necessarily that's a benefit or a detriment depending on how you look at it. So personally, I think if they limit Scapegoat, they did it in the OCG, I believe, so I think that would actually be okay, and that might be something that a lot of players, especially in the competitive player base, would be happy with. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about what you would want to see on this upcoming April ban list. I think it's very interesting that we don't really want this massive overhaul, but rather just a couple minor hits that bring some of these other decks in check, and we really have a good, healthy, diverse format that I think a majority of the player base is happy with, and I think if we can keep it that way, I think it's going to be generally good for everyone. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time. 1, 2, 3.